I actually held this next book up in the book haul number 4 that I posted earlier today. It was one of the books that I bought myself for Christmas. And I'd actually mentioned, too, that I'd already read this book. But the problem with the book that I read was that it was from a library. And whenever I read something from a library, uh, what I'll do is if I find it in a bookstore, I'll buy it and then just keep it and maybe make notes in it or something if I ever want to read it again. But every book that I've ever read, I like to have a copy of. And this is that book. It's called Errand into the Wilderness by Perry Miller, which is a set of 10 essays about early American, uh, colonial American, I should say, um, intellectual history. Um, Perry Miller's book, uh, more than any other I've read in a long time, makes you realize exactly how little education our educational institutions supposedly provide us with. Think, for example, of the Puritans, which is at the heart of these 10 essays. The word conjures up images of earnest, hard-working folk bedecked in gold buckles and ruffles, eager to spread their moral superiority to anyone within earshot, right? That's the sort of classic picture that you're provided with in school. We think of their biggest accomplishment as managing to survive disease and pestilence for so long despite their backward ways. The history we know of the Puritans is a history of events, things that they did, their names, their travels. Miller's fascinating book opens up Puritan history for those interested in intellectual history, a history of ideas, theology, polity, etc. And it's a really fascinating world that he uncovers too. While the main focus here in these essays is Puritanism, Miller does occasionally do a bit of wandering around. Some of the later essays explore Emerson and the formation of American nationalist ideology. Like I said, there are 10 essays in all of which are full of enticing, meaty history of ideas. So I won't be able to cover every single essay that the book covers here, but I would like to give a short summary of some of the essays that I thought would be most impressive, which I found to be most impressive. The book's title comes from one man named Samuel Danforth, whose sermon named A Brief Recognition of New England's Errand into the Wilderness sets the existential searching tone of the book, whose tenor can be found in each one of the essays. In the title essay, Miller notes the dual meaning of the word errand. It can mean a task done by an inferior for a superior, or it can refer to the task alone, the action itself. The first generation of Puritans to set foot on North American soil never thought of themselves as Americans. They were just Englishmen and Englishwomen whose task it was to see that the errand of the Reformation could be enacted on earth. In other words, they saw themselves very much performing an errand in the first sense that I mentioned. After the English Civil War had failed to turn the heads of the world to their glorious city on a hill, they were left with a vast wilderness to inhabit. These essays are full of how the Puritans fashioned a sense of meaning and a sense of worth and belonging, and eventually in time American identity, out of those very few raw ingredients whose presence still make themselves felt in American life: Calvinist theology, a sense of community, and profound intolerance. There's one essay in this collection called The Marrow of Puritan Divinity, and it's one of the longest and I think one of the best essays in the collection. It covers the shift from strict fundamentalist Calvinism to what Miller calls covenantal theology that took place sometime within the early part of the 17th century. Around 1550, strict Calvinism was still acceptable. The scientific revolution was still far off, and the abject nature of human beings was still de rigueur. The absolute and capricious power of God could still accept or reject human souls according to his whim. By 1650, however, the unscientific worldview that would allow this kind of God had, in some respects, given way. Theology had better learned to justify the ways of God to man, or else risk losing some of its influence. Some of the first important theologians, Puritan theologians, I should say, including Cotton, Hooker, Shepherd, and Bulkley, began to constitute a new school that broke from Calvinism in one important way. And that way is the incorporation of covenantal theology. No longer, according to these theologians, did you have to believe in God despite his mercurial nature, as you used to. Now when you professed a belief in God, you and he entered into a covenant. He turned into a God who is capable of making and keeping a promise. To quote Miller, he has become a God chained by his own consent, it is true, but nevertheless a God restricted and circumscribed, a God who can be counted upon, a God who can be lived with. Man can always know where God is and what he intends. So this relationship, this sort of brought on by the scientific revolution, changed our idea, or at least the Puritan idea of God, from a completely capricious, arbitrary one to one that was structured and formalized in the shape of a covenant. In a lot of ways, this essay forms the ideological core of the book, since Miller will discuss in the later essays many of the ways in which the covenant was absolutely essential in understanding Puritan civil society too, and church and state. In fact, Winthrop's constitutional ideas were based upon the notion of men coming together and forming an earthly covenant. So this idea pops up again and again. In another essay, Nature and the National Ego, Miller uses the trope of the wilderness and connects it to Emerson and the American identity writ large. He says that in contrast to Europe's nature, with the capital N, which is Miller, for some, I thought this was a bit odd, but I went with the argument. Miller calls effeminate, inferior, derivative. America has founded itself the original masculine quintessence of the wilderness. To support this idea, Miller points out that many American intellectuals in the 19th century began to worry about the possible effects of industrialization and the encroachment of civilization, fearing that its appearance might be proportional to the uniquely American identity that they might have to cede. He goes so far as to say that, quote, "If there be such a thing as an American character, it took shape under the molding influence of the conceptions of nature," again, that capital N, nature and civilization. Both chronologically and ideologically, these are the two essays that could couch really the rest of this wonderful collection. I would really recommend this for anyone sort of in search for an alternate view to the prevailing idea of America as being founded on religious tolerance and individualism, or just anyone excited, as I am, by old-fashioned American intellectual history. As I said in the book haul, there aren't many books that I'm aware of that occupy both of those spaces of intellectual history and very early American colonial history. It's a really unique find, and it also happens to be a rather spectacular book. Errand into the Wilderness by Perry Miller.